Wyatt McAllister hadn't spoken to another soul in 5 long days. Silence had become so normal he'd stopped counting it. Ever since Evelyn McAllister, his wife, died giving birth 3 winters ago. Words had lost their purpose. There wasn't much need for talking out here, unless someone in town forced it out of him. He lived alone on a stretch of land once meant for a family. The second room of his cabin still stood unfinished rafters, bare boards stacked neatly in a corner, waiting for a hammer that never came. He slept on a narrow cot near the door, not on the bed he once shared with Evelyn. That night, as the air turned sharp with cold, he went out to check his traps before the creek froze solid. If a catch iced over the hide would be worthless. Wyatt carried a lantern, a skinning knife, and a small canvas sack. Habit kept him moving, not hope. The ground under his boots was uneven, soft, where the frost hadn't set. He preferred the quiet of evenings, no travelers passing by, no chatter, no one to look in the eye. His life had shrunk down to survival, enough meat, enough repairs, and keeping the cabin from collapsing in on itself. After losing his wife and the baby she never got to hold, he'd accepted that this was all there was. Routine. Work. Solitude. By the 4th trap, something disturbed the rhythm of the night, a sound too sharp to belong to the wind. A breath caught with pain. Wyatt froze, lantern raised. At first it looked like a pile of torn clothes scattered across the rocks. Then he saw movement, an arm, a shoulder. He stepped closer, careful not to slip. A young Apache woman lay half-curled near the creek bed. Her dress was ripped open across the chest. One strap gone, the fabric torn deep enough to reveal her skin. The side seam had split high on her thigh, showing bruises and scrapes. Mud streaked her legs. She was barefoot, her feet raw and bleeding. Blood soaked the side of her ribs where she pressed her hand tightly. Her eyes opened when his shadow fell over her, terror flashing first. Her body stiffened, ready for another blow. She didn't know who he was, only that another man was standing above her. Wyatt saw the panic in her breathing, the way her eyes darted, searching for escape. She tried to push away, but her arm trembled and gave out. He didn't touch her yet. He wasn't sure how badly she was hurt, or if whoever did this was still nearby. He scanned the creek and brush, then crouched down. His voice came rough, unused. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't answer. Her jaw locked tight. Wyatt saw the dried blood on her lip, the bruise along her cheekbone. She was fading fast, but fought sleep like she knew closing her eyes meant danger. Leaving her here meant death by men or by the cold. Without another thought, he slid one arm beneath her back, the other under her legs. She panicked, clutching weakly at his coat, but had no strength left to fight. Her body shook violently from blood loss and cold. When he lifted her, she whimpered and gripped his shirt with trembling fingers. The walk back took time. The lantern swung, lighting only a narrow path ahead. Her eyes stayed half open, filled with fear and exhaustion. Wyatt adjusted his hold, easing pressure off her ribs whenever she gasped. The cabin waited in darkness. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. Bare living one table, one stove, a cot, a bed he never used. Tools hung on nails. His late wife's belongings remained untouched, tucked away, but never forgotten. He laid the woman on the bed. She tried to cover herself, clutching the torn dress when he leaned in to inspect her wound. Her hands shook. She watched him like she expected him to take more than a look. "I'm fixing it," he said quietly. He cut around the gash, steady hands working through the torn leather. She grimaced, but made no sound. He cleaned the wound with water from the basin, washing away dirt, and dried blood, then wrapped it tightly with strips of cloth he kept for his own injuries. Every pull of the bandage made her flinch, but she stayed still. Her chest was still exposed, the fabric shredded. Wyatt didn't linger on what he saw. He turned to the trunk, pulled out a quilt Evelyn had sewn years ago, and covered her to the shoulders. When he tucked the blanket near her collarbone, his fingers brushed the curve of her breast by accident. She tensed immediately. He stepped back at once. "You're safe here. Sleep." His voice was low, steady. She didn't close her eyes right away, only watched as he lit the stove and settled by the door with his rifle across his knees. He made no move toward her, no sign of harm. Her breathing slowed. Still clutching the quilt to her chest, she finally drifted into uneasy sleep. Wyatt stayed awake. He fed the fire and listened to the wind until dawn, keeping watch like a man who'd already lost too much to ever risk losing more. Wyatt pulled back, keeping his voice calm. "You're safe here. Rest." She didn't close her eyes right away. Her gaze followed him as he walked to the stove, lit a small flame, and sat on the floor beside the door with his rifle close at hand. He made no move toward her, didn't touch the blanket, didn't undo a thing. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, at first, then slowed as fear gave way to exhaustion. The quilt stayed clutched against her chest where the leather of her dress had split. Eventually sleep took her, her brow still furrowed, her breath shallow. Wyatt McAllister didn't sleep. He kept the fire alive and listened for the faintest sound beyond the walls. For the first time since digging the graves behind the cabin, he barred the door. His body had long grown used to sleepless nights. By dawn, the fire had burned down to orange coals glowing faintly against the dark wood. The woman Lila Skyhawk, though he didn't yet know her name, was still breathing her skin slick with sweat. Fever, he thought, maybe from the wound or the freezing night she'd survived. He leaned over quietly and checked the bandage. It held though blood had seeped through near the edge. He'd change it when she woke. Then he noticed her feet. In the dim light, he hadn't realized how bad they were swollen cut, and raw, small stones still embedded in the torn flesh. Whoever had chased her hadn't given her time to rest, much less shoes to run in. Wyatt filled a clean tin bowl with warm water from the kettle and brought it beside the bed. He touched her ankle lightly, and her eyes shot open wild and ready to defend herself even in weakness. "I'm just cleaning the cuts," he said softly, keeping the same calm tone as before. She didn't understand the words, but his voice eased something in her. Her fingers gripped the quilt tightly while he lifted her foot and lowered it into the warm water. She winced as the heat met open wounds, but she didn't pull away. Wyatt worked slowly, removing bits of grit and washing away blood with a damp cloth. Her breaths came quick and shallow, but she endured it in silence. When he finished, he wrapped her feet with strips torn from an old shirt. The quilt slipped slightly from her shoulder, revealing more of her torn dress. Wyatt turned away immediately. "Keep that blanket up," he murmured. "You're bleeding through." She didn't answer, but he heard the faint rustle of fabric as she covered herself again. He poured water into a tin cup and placed it on the crate beside the bed. "Drink before you sleep again." She stared at the cup, then at him, suspicious at first, as though expecting a trick. When she finally lifted it with both hands, he saw the tremor in her fingers. She drank slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. Questions crowded his mind: where she came from, who had hurt her, whether they were still out there, but asking wouldn't change a thing. If those men came, he'd face them when they did. For now, she needed to stay alive. She tried to speak, then her voice dry and weak words in Apache he couldn't understand. She pointed toward the door, then to her chest, then the woods outside. Her breathing hitched, panic rising again. "You're not going back out there," Wyatt said firmly. She didn't know his language, but his tone carried enough meaning. Slowly she sank back into the bed, exhaustion swallowing her fear. The moment her head met the pillow, her eyes closed once more. Wyatt added another log to the stove and stepped outside. The morning bit cold against his skin. Frost clung to the grass, to the roof seams, and to the rails of the corral where Ranger and Dustfoot waited quietly. He checked the ground around the cabin, scanning for unfamiliar tracks. Nothing. The horses stamped their hooves, softly calm, unaware of the storm that had passed. Wyatt broke the thin ice in their troughs and filled their feed bags. He thought about riding to town Redstone Hollow to fetch bandages or medicine from Ezekiel Pike's trading post, but leaving her alone didn't sit right. He hadn't left anyone inside this cabin since the night Evelyn McAllister bled out in that very bed. He'd failed her once. He wouldn't bury another. Back inside, he set beans to soak and brewed a pot of strong coffee. The scent filled the room, stirring something deep, memories of mornings when laughter had once belonged here. The woman still slept, her breathing uneven but steady. Wyatt cleaned his knife eyes, flicking often to the window. 2 hours passed before she stirred again. She woke suddenly, as if startled by a dream. He saw the fear return before she even remembered where she was. Her gaze darted to the door, then back to him, uncertain whether she'd been saved or captured. Wyatt kept his voice calm, steady. "You're hurt. You stay here until you can walk without bleeding." She didn't know the words, but she studied his face like she was trying to measure the man behind them. He could see the battle in her eyes, trying to decide if she was safe or a prisoner. He pointed to himself. "Wyatt," he said, then nodded toward her, waiting. She hesitated, then spoke a single word, quiet and strained, almost a whisper. He couldn't repeat it if he tried, but he nodded once, showing he understood. She held the quilt tight to her chest, clutching it like armor. Her eyes flicked to the door again, as if expecting someone, maybe the ones who hurt her, to come crashing through. Before he could speak, the silence outside broke. Footsteps. Unsteady. Not one pair, two. Wyatt grabbed his rifle and moved to the door. Boots silent on the floorboards. When he pulled it open, 2 more Apache women stood in the weak light just beyond the step. One leaned hard on the other, her leg bleeding down to her ankle. Their faces were bruised, hair-tangled, breaths coming in sharp, broken bursts. They didn't run. They just stared at him, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Behind him, Lila Skyhawk whispered something in her native tongue, not in fear this time, but in warning. Maybe recognition. Wyatt didn't raise the rifle, but he didn't lower it either. The 2 women looked half-conscious, bare feet, raw from travel, mud crusted along their legs, bruises dark against their skin. The one supporting the other had blood streaking her calf. Neither spoke. Lila pushed herself up on her elbows when she heard them, breath hitching with pain, but she tried to sit anyway. Wyatt stepped aside silently. He didn't touch them, didn't ask questions. He simply moved enough so they could see past him and know he wasn't blocking the way. The taller of the 2 studied him through half-lidded eyes, sharp even through exhaustion. The wounded woman leaned heavier on her shoulder, both unsure if stepping inside was safety or suicide. "Come in," he said softly, "before you fall." They didn't know the language, but his voice and his lack of threat said enough. The taller one guided the other over the threshold, Their steps dragged across the wooden floor, slow, weary. Lila watched from the bed, fear and relief tangled on her face. She whispered something in Apache too soft for Wyatt to catch. The newcomers looked at her, then at Wyatt, then at the bandage around her ribs. They spoke in quick, clipped tones, confirming she was alive. Wyatt shut the door behind them, but didn't bar it. He pointed toward the crate by the stove. "Here." They followed the gesture. The one with the wounded leg eased herself down, stifling a wince as her knee bent. The other stayed standing, eyes darting between Wyatt and Lila, protective, suspicious. He could see the distrust, but also the fatigue that weighed down their bodies. He poured water into a tin pot and set it over the fire. They needed cleaning food and bandages. The rest could wait. One problem at a time. Lila tried to sit higher to see the others better, but the pain in her ribs stopped her. Wyatt walked over, lifted the quilt, and pulled it gently higher over her shoulders, partly to cover her, partly to block the cold seeping through the cabin. She tensed at his nearness, but didn't resist. He checked the bandage. The bleeding had slowed. "Lie back," he said quietly. She did, her eyes never leaving the two women. Wyatt turned to the one with the leg wound. She sat, stiff fingers gripping the crate. He crouched beside her and pointed at his own calf. "Injury," he said. She understood the gesture, lifting her torn dress to show the gash. It wasn't deep, but it was long, and the blood had dried thick around it. Wyatt grabbed a clean cloth and a bowl of warm water. She froze when he reached out, her jaw tight, expecting pain or worse. But he worked in silence, washing away dirt and blood-steady hands, never straying. When he wrapped her leg with a strip of cotton, her breathing eased. She glanced once toward her companion, who stood close, ready to intervene if needed. When he finished, Wyatt looked up at the taller woman. A bruise darkened her cheekbone, swelling beneath her eye. It didn't look broken, but he needed to be sure. She leaned back only when she realized he wouldn't touch her anywhere else. For the first time that night, the air inside the cabin felt less like fear and more like fragile truce. Once Wyatt stepped back, the three women exchanged quick looks and a few hushed words in their own tongue. He didn't understand them, but their glances said enough. They were deciding whether to stay or run again. Lila Skyhawk, the one he'd carried from the creek, watched them from the bed, her fingers gripping the quilt so tightly her knuckles whitened. She whispered something low and tense, a warning, or maybe a plea, and the other two fell silent. Wyatt turned to the fire, set a small pot over the flames, and dropped in a handful of beans with a scrap of dried venison. They hadn't eaten in days. He could tell by the way their eyes followed every movement of his hands. He kept himself busy, the rifle never far from reach. He wasn't careless, but he wasn't sending them out into the cold either. As the stew began to simmer, he pulled a chair against the wall and sat, elbows resting on his knees, eyes shifting between the window and the door. The last time more than one person had filled this cabin was the night Wyatt McAllister went into labor. He could still see her face pale as the snow outside her hand clutching his until the last breath left her body. No baby's cry, just silence and a grave dug behind the pines, sometimes for both mother and child. He'd sworn then that the cabin would hold no one else. Yet now 3 strangers sat inside, one lying in Evelyn's bed, another bleeding onto his floor. He didn't know their words, but their fear spoke plain. They'd run from something, men who treated them like prey. Lila's eyes kept flicking toward the window, half expecting those men to appear again. When the food was ready, Wyatt set 3 tin cups of water on the table and ladled out the stew. He handed the first bowl to the woman with the leg wound, Tessa Redbird, who hesitated as though expecting him to snatch it back or demand something in return. When he didn't, she passed another portion to the taller woman, Naya Moonfeather. Wyatt brought the last bowl to Lila. She ate slowly, stealing cautious glances between bites, as if waiting for the man's kindness to turn. Wyatt ate last, standing near the stove, giving them space. The only sounds were the quiet clink of spoons and the soft crackle of firewood. No one spoke, not even to each other. When the bowls were empty, Naya pointed toward the door, then to the dark line of trees outside. Her eyes asked what her mouth couldn't. Was danger still near? Wyatt shook his head. No tracks but mine, he said simply. She didn't understand the words, but his calm seemed to ease her. He added another log to the fire. Checked the rifle once more. Outside, the sun was sinking, stretching shadows across the floorboards. The cabin, once meant for two, now held 4 souls unsure of tomorrow. But the door stayed shut, not locked, and no one tried to leave. Night fell quiet and heavy. The air was close, but not hostile. Wyatt unrolled his cot by the door and set it up near the wall, leaving the bed for Lila and the floor near the stove for the other 2. He gave them his spare wool blanket and an old coat with a torn sleeve. Tessa lay down first, wincing as her leg bent. Naya stayed awake longer, her sharp eyes sweeping over the walls and windows. She wouldn't sleep until she knew they were truly safe. Wyatt didn't speak. Words couldn't fix what had been done to them. He checked the fire, poured more water into the kettle, and kept his rifle close. Lila slept restlessly, jaw clenched, her breathing uneven. When she turned, the quilt slipped down her shoulder, revealing the torn edge of her bodice. Wyatt turned his head away, pretending not to notice. He could mend the leather later if she let him. Questions spun quietly in his mind. Were they running from soldiers, outlaws, settlers, or their own people? And if the men who'd hurt them were still alive, would they come here? He'd already buried 2 graves in the dirt behind his cabin. He wouldn't dig a third. At last, Naya settled down beside the stove, her hand resting near Tessa's bandaged leg. She watched Wyatt with wary eyes, like a cornered animal, testing whether a hand meant to strike or help. When she saw he didn't move closer, her shoulders lowered. Her eyes drifted shut, not out of trust, but sheer exhaustion. Wyatt sat until the fire burned low red coals glowing dimly. He didn't close his eyes until the first pale light of dawn crept through the cracks in the wall. By morning, the world outside was still. No fresh tracks, no smoke, no movement in the trees. Inside, Lila woke first. She sat up slowly, clutching the quilt to her chest, her gaze meeting Wyatt's. The wildness in her eyes had softened, though caution still lingered. The swelling on her cheek had faded, her breathing steadier now. She spoke softly in her tongue. Short words he didn't understand, and pointed toward the 2 women still sleeping. He understood enough they were hers. Family. Survivors from the same hell. He poured her a cup of water and handed it to her. She didn't thank him, but she didn't flinch when his sleeve brushed the edge of her blanket either. That was enough. For now. When she finished, Wyatt asked one question, not because he thought she'd answer, but because silence felt heavier than words. How far did you come? She didn't understand, but her hand moved to the scar along her ribs. Then she pointed north toward the hills and closed her fist tight. He understood more from that gesture than from any language Taken escaped. Soon, the smell of coffee and oats stirred the others awake. Tessa Redbird's leg had stopped bleeding, though she winced when she tried to stand. Wyatt knelt beside her, tightening the bandage to keep pressure on the wound. The taller woman, Naya Moonfeather, only let him close after Lila Skyhawk spoke to her in a sharp, steady tone. Whatever Lila said earned her trust, because Naya finally stepped aside and let Wyatt work. They ate quietly again, but the air had shifted. The fear that once filled every breath had started to ease. Small things meant everything. None of them hovered near the door now. None looked at him like he might turn on them mid-bite. Lila's hands no longer shook when she lifted a spoon. After breakfast, Wyatt stepped outside to split wood. He left the door unbarred but stayed close. The sound of his axe echoed through the still morning air. Inside, the women kept near the warmth of the stove, uncertain if stepping outside would mean danger. Eventually, Lila appeared in the doorway, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She watched him swing the axe in a steady rhythm, her dark hair loose and tangled from sleep. She held the blanket closed at her chest, her torn dress still gaping beneath. Wyatt noticed her watching but didn't speak. From the corner of his eye, he saw her gaze drift toward the graves behind the cabin, 2 mounds marked with stones and a weathered wooden cross. She stared for a long time, then looked back at him, understanding more than words could ever say. When his shoulders began to ache, he went back inside. Naya had gathered the dirty bandages and laid them near the stove to dry. Tessa sat with her injured leg stretched out, half awake but present. Lila stood by the window, still clutching the quilt close. Wyatt pointed to his chest. "Wyatt," he said, then motioned toward her, inviting a name. She hesitated, then spoke it clearly, her voice soft but firm. "Lila." He repeated it once, not perfect, but close enough. She nodded. He pointed toward the others. Tessa said the injured one, and after a pause the tall one answered Naya. He echoed both names quietly, and something subtle shifted still, not trust, but recognition. Later, while reheating beans for midday, Wyatt finally spoke the thought that had been gnawing at him since they arrived. "If men come looking," he muttered to himself, "this cabin won't hold." He checked his revolver, the rifle by the door, the hatchet near the woodpile. Supplies were fine, but backup was none. Naya watched him reload the rifle, her jaw tight. She whispered something quick to Tessa, the words sharp with unease. Lila met his eyes, then glanced toward the northern hills again. Wyatt understood enough whoever had hurt them wasn't done. He sat on the edge of the table, his tone level but certain. "No one comes here without me knowing first, and if they do, they won't leave easy." They didn't understand the words, but Lila held his gaze and nodded slowly, choosing to believe what she felt in his voice. Outside, clouds gathered low over the ridge, the air turning heavy with the taste of an oncoming storm. Wyatt knew something was out there, but he also knew he wouldn't turn these women away. Not now, not with Wyatt McAllister's grave already behind the cabin. By noon, the sky turned flat and gray, pressing low against the hills. Wyatt stepped out to bring in more wood and scanned the ground. No tracks. Nothing moving in the trees. But the quiet didn't feel like peace. It felt like a pause before something worse. Inside, the 3 women stayed close to the fire, their clothes still torn and dirt-stained. They had no blankets, no shoes, nothing but the rags on their backs. Wyatt looked at them, realizing that if anyone came looking, their wounds alone would tell the story. He turned toward the shelf above the trunk, where Evelyn's things had remained untouched since the burial. A shawl, a spare coat, a half-finished dress. He'd left them there for years because moving them felt like disturbing a ghost. But ghosts didn't need warmth. These women did. He laid the clothes gently on the table without a word. Lila looked at him, uncertain if the offer was real or another test of trust. Wyatt stepped back and pointed once toward the table before turning to refill the stove. The women hesitated only a moment before Naya Moonfeather sifted through the garments, carefully choosing what might fit. Tessa Redbird ran her fingers over the fabric, as if she couldn't remember the last time she'd been allowed to choose something for herself. Lila Skyhawk touched the shawl gently, her gaze flicking to Wyatt like she expected him to change his mind. He didn't look at them while they dressed, just kept his back turned long enough to give them a measure of privacy as they covered torn seams and bruised skin. When he finally glanced back, Lila had pulled the shawl tight around her shoulders, hiding the torn bodice that had left her so exposed. It didn't fix everything, but at least she no longer clutched the blanket just to keep herself covered. Tessa tied a strip of cloth around her waist to conceal the tear in her skirt, and Naya bound her long, dark hair instead of letting it hang loose and wild. Wyatt stirred the pot of beans, adding what little was left of the salted pork. It wasn't much, certainly not enough for 4 people for long. Supplies would run out fast. Going to Redstone Hollow alone was always a risk, but now it was something else entirely. If anyone saw the women recognized their wounds, or the direction they'd come from, there'd be talk. And talk out here had a way of reaching the wrong ears. He finally asked the question he'd avoided since the moment he found Lila not with words, but with signs. He pointed north, then held up 4 fingers, then pointed to them. Lila stiffened. She turned to the others and spoke in sharp, quick Apache. Naya replied, with the same tension in her voice. Tessa looked down silent, her eyes clouded with shame or fear. Then Lila faced him again and raised 3 fingers, lowering them one by one, before cutting the air with a motion like slicing a rope. 3 men. Maybe more. An escape, not a rescue. Wyatt nodded once. He didn't need to understand the language to know danger had a number. That afternoon he fetched water from the creek. The women stayed inside, quiet and alert. Every time the wind shifted, they glanced toward the door. Naya kept the hatchet within reach. Tessa's hand hovered near her leg, as if bracing for a chase that hadn't started yet. Lila sat by the window, the shawl around her shoulders, watching the tree line like she expected gunfire or a voice calling out her name. Wyatt thought about boarding the windows but decided against it. Doing that would make them feel trapped, and he wasn't about to cage anyone again. While the kettle warmed, he repaired the torn leather of Lila's dress. He didn't touch her while he worked. He waited until she'd set it aside and sat in the shawl instead. With his head bent low, he stitched the seam across the bodice, steady and precise. When he finished, he folded the dress and placed it near her without a word. She brushed her fingers over the new stitching, her throat tightening. She didn't thank him, not in words, but he saw her hand relax her grip on the quilt, easing for the first time. As dusk approached, Wyatt did something simple, something they hadn't realized they'd been waiting for. He gave them their names back. "Wyatt," he said, tapping his chest, so they'd understand. Then, nodding toward the women in turn, he repeated softly, "Lila, Tessa, Naya." He spoke each name clearly, his tone firm, not as a question, but as recognition. The women exchanged glances, startled but not afraid. When the light faded, they ate again. This time, Lila lifted her tin cup without words and held it out. Wyatt filled it, their fingers nearly touching. For a heartbeat, the air between them changed, quiet, human. The storm came at sundown, a mix of rain and sleet drumming hard against the roof. The sound made all 3 women lift their heads, their muscles tensing from old reflexes. Wyatt added more wood to the fire and kept his rifle angled so both the door and window stayed in sight. Lila slept, sitting upright, the mended dress folded beneath the shawl, her chest finally covered without fear. Tessa stretched her injured leg toward the fire and drifted into half-sleep. Naya leaned against the wall, one eye open, until exhaustion won. Before dousing the lamp, Wyatt glanced out the window toward the 2 graves under the pines. Then his eyes moved to the 3 shapes resting inside the women who'd stumbled into his solitude and turned it into something fragile but alive. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for any of it. But as the wind howled through the hills and the fire glowed low, he realized he finally had a reason to keep the light burning past nightfall. He lay down on the cot by the door, the same one he always took when guarding what little he had left. Sleep came slow, his ears tuned to every creak and gust outside. The storm raged most of the night, rain turning to sleet and back again. The noise on the roof drowned out whatever else might have been out there, and that somehow unnerved him more than silence ever could. By dawn, the wind had gone still. The world outside was soaked in gray, the ground slick with mud and patches of ice. The danger hadn't passed, it had only gone quiet. Wyatt rose before dawn, before the women stirred. He threw on his coat, took up his rifle, and stepped out into the brittle morning air. Frost clung to the grass, and the pine needles shimmered with thin ice. He circled the cabin slowly, scanning the ground for anything he might have missed the night before. Boot prints, hoof marks, the faint press of a man's step. There was nothing. The snow had fallen clean, covering all but his own tracks. He followed the creek a short distance toward the ridge, the water running dark under a skin of ice. Nothing new there either. The storm had erased the past like a hand wiping a slate. When he came back, the women were awake. Lila Skyhawk, still wrapped in Evelyn McAllister's shawl, sat on the edge of the bed, watching the door. Naya Moonfeather stood near the window, eyes narrowed toward the tree line, her shoulders tense, as if expecting ghosts to emerge from the woods. Tessa Redbird tried to stand but stumbled, pain shooting up her leg. Wyatt reached instinctively and caught her arm. The moment his hand touched her, she jerked like she'd been struck, her breath tearing short. Fear flared in her eyes, wild and raw. He released her at once and stepped back, raising both palms to show he meant no harm. Tessa steadied herself against the crate, exhaling through gritted teeth. Wyatt set a kettle on to boil and split a few sticks of kindling while silence thickened around them. Then Lila's soft voice broke it low, careful speaking to Tessa as she checked the bandage on her leg. Naya moved with quiet precision, clearing space near the fire and adjusting blankets so Tessa could stretch her leg without strain. Watching them, Wyatt realized something new. Whatever nightmare had driven them to his door, they weren't strangers thrown together, they were women used to surviving as one. Lila's gaze flicked toward the patched dress he'd mended the night before. She didn't put it on yet, but she folded it neatly and set it beside her feet, her movements gentle, deliberate. They ate in near silence, beans and venison strips, the last scrape of coffee grounds stretched thin. He'd need to make a supply run soon, but leaving them alone was out of the question. Taking them to Redstone Hollow would only draw eyes and questions he couldn't answer. After breakfast, Naya gestured toward the window, then the trees. Her hand cut a line through the air, a warning of men of pursuit. Wyatt spoke evenly, his voice low but sure. "If anyone comes looking, I'll see them before they ever reach this door." He tapped the rifle, leaning against the wall. Naya studied him carefully, searching his tone for deceit. She found none. Lila murmured something, then her name spoken softly once more. She pointed to her chest, then to Tessa and Naya in turn. This time she added another phrase, touching her ribs, then motioning northward and miming a knife drawn at the waist. Wyatt understood enough. Whoever had hurt them weren't just raiders, they were men who thought they owned what they took. And they might still be hunting. He made his decision then quietly but firm. Promises didn't mean much out here, but his actions would. He crossed the room, opened the trunk by the wall, and pulled out his spare rifle, an old lever action. He set it on the table beside a small box of cartridges. He didn't hand it over directly, just left it where Naya could reach. Her eyes widened a fraction, not in fear, but disbelief. No white man had ever handed her a gun before. She didn't ask what to do with it, she already knew. Her fingers checked the chamber, the grip, the sight line steady and sure. Tessa watched with quiet understanding. Lila ribs still bound, and the shawl draped around her shoulders finally let her jaw unclench. While the kettle heated, Wyatt noticed their glances toward the window, the direction of the graves behind the cabin. He wiped his hands on a rag and spoke, voice rougher now. "My wife, my boy." That was all he said. It was enough. Lila bowed her head slightly, not in prayer but in recognition. Naya's posture softened. Tessa's hand brushed the blanket near her knee, her thoughts somewhere far away, on someone she'd lost too. By midday, the sleet had turned to a thin, drifting snow. Wyatt fixed the latch on the front door that always stuck in the cold, then checked the traps stacked near the wall. He'd have to reset them soon, farther out far enough not to leave the women unprotected. When he turned back, Lila stood before him the first time she'd approached, without fear leading her steps. She pointed to the patched dress, then to herself, a silent question asking if she could change. He nodded once and turned away. Behind the quilt he'd hung for privacy, Naya helped her. When Lila stepped out again, the leather bodice no longer hung open. The shawl still rested around her shoulders, but her hands didn't clutch it like armor anymore. Wyatt didn't linger, but he noticed the way the dress fit her again. The curve of her waist, the pale line of her collarbone above the stitching. Not desire, not yet. Just life reclaiming shape after being nearly lost. He turned back to the stove, stirred the coals, and told himself it was just another morning's work. But deep down he knew something in the cabin had changed quietly, irreversibly. Wyatt kept his focus on the rifle stock he was oiling, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look toward the women. Tessa Redbird had drifted into a shallow sleep near the fire, her injured leg stretched out toward the warmth. Naya Moonfeather cleaned the tin dishes in silence, her expression unreadable. Lila Skyhawk sat quietly on the edge of the bed, the mended bodice now covering what had been bare the night before. Her eyes lingered on Wyatt, not with fear this time, but with an unspoken question. That question hung between them like smoke in the air. What happens when the men chasing us find this place? Wyatt didn't answer, not aloud. But he'd already made up his mind the door would never open to them. Outside, snow fell soft and steady through the morning, dusting the fence posts and blanketing the yard in white silence. Wyatt split the last of the dry wood, cutting shorter pieces and stacking them inside. He didn't want to be caught outside if trouble came. The women stayed in the cabin quiet but alert. Every creak of the boards or whistle of wind pulled their eyes toward the walls. Food was running: low beans, a handful of dried venison, 2 soft apples, and coffee grounds, barely enough for a pot. Maybe 2 days' worth, if stretched thin. Normally Wyatt would have ridden into Redstone Hollow for supplies, flour, salt, cartridges, maybe even coffee if the price hadn't jumped. But now leaving them alone wasn't an option, and taking them into town, that would stir questions he couldn't afford to answer. Naya read the tension in his pacing. She pointed at the rifle, then to the window, then to herself. It wasn't a question, it was a promise. She was ready to fight if anyone came. Tessa sat by the fire, tracing the edge of her bandage with tired fingers. Lila, her ribs still bound, sat on the bed, the repaired dress and shawl, hiding the scars and bruises she'd carried in. She kept glancing toward the door, not with panic now, but the wary patience of someone waiting for footsteps that hadn't yet come. Wyatt laid out what food remained on the table: beans, half a strip of salted pork, 2 apples, soft with bruises, and a heel of hard bread. He pulled open a drawer and checked his supply list, what he'd used, what he needed before the snow deepened, what he could trade with Ezekiel Pike at the post. He didn't know if they'd last until spring without being found or starving first. Lila watched him, her dark eyes steady. She pointed toward the table, then made a slow circular motion, her brow furrowed in question. How long could this last? Wyatt broke a piece of bread, held it between his fingers, then shook his head. Not long, he said quietly, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but would hear the truth in his tone. Naya said something sharp in Apache, her voice carrying the kind of weight born from command. Tessa answered softly, her tone rasped with fatigue. Lila listened, then looked toward the hills. Whatever they were discussing wasn't about food. It was about the past and the men still out there. Wyatt finally said what he'd been thinking since sunrise. He pointed to himself mimed holding reins, then gestured toward the road leading west. Then he pointed back to the cabin to Naya and Tessa, and mimed guarding it. He didn't need to explain further, the message was clear. He'd go alone for supplies. They'd hold the cabin until he returned. Naya's jaw tightened as she considered it. She picked up the rifle he'd given her, tested the lever once, then nodded. She knew what it meant to stay behind. Tessa murmured something under her breath, but Lila touched her arm, quieting her. Then slowly Lila rose to her feet, careful not to strain her ribs, and stepped in front of Wyatt. She pointed at him, then at the graves behind the cabin, then at herself. She didn't need words. He understood. She knew death had already been here, and she wouldn't let it return. Wyatt didn't argue. He set his revolver on the table, opened the cylinder, and loaded each chamber one by one. The women watched in silence as he laid out extra cartridges beside it. Naya took the revolver without hesitation. Tessa checked the door latch and tightened the bar. Then Wyatt crouched by the stove and opened the trapdoor beneath it, revealing the hidden compartment where he kept the rest of his tools for survival: a second hatchet, a hunting knife, and a short-handled shotgun with 2 shells. He set them out on the floor. The women gathered around the weapons like soldiers sharing a plan. They weren't strangers to fear, but neither were they strangers to battle. By mid-afternoon, Wyatt saddled Ranger, his leanest horse, for fast travel. The snow thinned as he rode out along the creek, following the narrow path that cut through the pines and led toward the trading post. Every few miles he scanned the ground, half expecting to see new tracks, boot prints, or hoof marks heading the other way. But there was nothing yet. Back at the cabin, the women barred the door as soon as he disappeared from sight. Tessa stayed near the fire, the shotgun within reach. Naya took her place by the window rifle resting across her knees, eyes fixed on the tree line. Lila sat on the bed, breathing slow but awake, her hand always within reach of a knife. Wyatt didn't look back until the cabin was swallowed by trees and distance. Only then did he realize how strange it felt leaving someone behind to guard his home. For years it had only been him against the wilderness. Now, for the first time, the cabin wasn't just his. It was theirs, too. When Wyatt McAllister finally looked back, it wasn't because of doubt. It was because he needed to remember. The image of 3 women still alive in that lonely cabin where death had lingered too long was something worth keeping in his mind. If anyone tried to trail him home, he'd spot them first. And if trouble reached the cabin before he returned, those women wouldn't be helpless. He rode hard through the cold morning ranger's hooves, biting into the frozen ground until the pine forest thinned and the narrow wagon road came into view. The nearest trading post sat a few miles past the ridge, a sagging shack with barrels stacked outside sacks of grain against the wall, and a man who cared more about silver than conversation. Wyatt tied Ranger and stepped inside, his breath still white from the chill. He grabbed what he needed: flour beans, dried venison, salt, a small sack of coffee grounds, and cartridges. He spoke little, keeping his hat low. The shopkeeper, a thick man with thinning hair, looked him over with suspicion. "Don't see you much since summer," he muttered, weighing the beans. "Cold's comin' early. Folks headin' south while they still can." Wyatt didn't answer. He paid what was owed, slung the supplies over his shoulder, and headed out without tying the load. There was no time for neatness, just speed. The ride home took longer. The wind came sharp across the plains, slicing through his coat. Clouds rolled low and heavy gray with another storm. His eyes scanned every bend in the trail, watching for riders or smoke from a campfire. Nothing. Still, his jaw stayed tight. Back at the cabin, the silence inside had a strange weight to it. The fire burned low but steady. Tessa Redbird sat near the hearth, the shotgun laid across her lap. Naya Moonfeather watched from the window, her gaze fixed on the tree-line rifle resting across the sill. Lila Skyhawk sat on the bed, one arm wrapped around her ribs. Her body was still weak, but her spirit hadn't dimmed. The fear in her eyes had turned to something else, wary vigilance. When the faint sound of hooves broke through the stillness, Naya didn't flinch. She aimed low through the window, her finger steady on the trigger, until she recognized the rider. Only when she saw Wyatt dismount alone did her shoulders ease. No one smiled, but the air in the cabin shifted. The tension that had lived there like a second shadow finally loosened. Wyatt set the supplies down, shrugged off his coat, and started unpacking. The women watched everything, every can, sack, and box. Their eyes followed his hands, counting what would keep them alive a little longer. Wyatt poured flour into one tin, beans into another, and set the coffee on the table. He laid the cartridges neatly in a row. Lila reached for the coffee bag, her fingers brushing the coarse fabric, a faint, wistful look crossing her face, as if remembering the smell from somewhere safe. Tessa exhaled quietly, her shoulders dropping for the first time in days. Naya checked the rifle stock one more time, then leaned it against the wall instead of gripping it tight. Wyatt cooked without speaking. Venison stew thickened with beans, salt, and a bit of coffee water for flavor. The smell filled the cabin, warm and real, cutting through the cold weight of fear that had settled there. When they ate, the change was clear. They didn't eat like starving people anymore. They took slower bites, steady, knowing there'd be food again tomorrow. Lila passed her tin cup to Tessa without being asked, and Naya sat with her back no longer pressed to the wall. Afterward, Wyatt wiped his hands on a rag and finally said what had hung unsaid since the moment he'd found them. "What happens next?" He pointed toward the window, mimed a man on horseback, then lifted an invisible rifle. Finally, he pointed at the three women, then the door, shaking his head once. His meaning was plain. No one takes you from here without a fight. Lila watched his face the whole time, her gaze steady and unflinching. She didn't need to understand the words, she understood the man. Her hand went to her ribs, tracing the mended seam, then to the quilt, then down to the wooden floor. She was saying it without words. "I'm staying." Naya lifted 2 fingers and pointed north, tapping twice her message, just as clear. "The danger still waits out there." And Wyatt nodded, his jaw set. He already knew. The men who had hurt them were still out there somewhere, Tessa Redbird said as much in her quiet, trembling voice. Her tone cracked on the last word, and Lila Skyhawk reached over, steadying her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. Wyatt McAllister didn't answer with words. He never did when it came to fear. His answer came through motion. He checked the rifle leaning by the door, spun the chamber on his revolver, and reloaded the shotgun. Each cartridge clicked into place with calm precision. Then he lined up the extra rounds on the table in perfect rows, an unspoken promise that if danger came, it would meet resistance. He took the axe outside and began splitting wood, though they already had plenty stacked. The rhythm of the blade biting into timber sent a message to whoever might be watching through the trees. This was no empty cabin, and the man inside could still fight. When he came back in, Lila was standing near the fire. The shawl draped over her shoulders no longer looked like armor. It looked like warmth. The mended dress covered her now, though it was threadbare in places. She turned toward him as he entered. Her gaze held steady. No fear, no retreat. Naya Moonfeather moved a crate and wedged it against the door for reinforcement. Tessa fed wood into the stove, her limp barely noticeable now. Lila folded the spare blanket and placed it neatly beside the bed. Their movements weren't those of guests anymore. They were settlers claiming a space that had almost forgotten what life felt like. Night fell hard, bringing a wind that whistled through the eaves like a warning. Wyatt sat on the cot with his back against the wall rifle across his knees. The three women found their own places without a word, Tessa by the fire's glow, Naya near the window, with her eyes scanning the darkness, and Lila on the bed where he had first laid her that night in the storm. He hadn't planned for this, for a home that breathed again. For years, the cabin had been a tomb of silence holding the ghosts of Evelyn and Samuel McAllister. But now that silence was different. It wasn't hollow. It was full heavy with presence and shared breath. If riders came, if boot tracks appeared through the snow, or a shadow crested the ridge, none of them would flee. They would fight together. 2 days passed without sign of anyone. Wyatt walked the perimeter each dawn, checking for tracks before tending to Ranger and Dustfoot. Inside, the women stayed close to the fire until he returned not from command, but instinct, born of survival. Food held steady thanks to the last trip to Ezekiel Pike's trading post. The cabin no longer looked like a lonely man's refuge. It looked lived in. Lila's shawl was folded neatly each night, instead of clutched in fear. Tessa's limp had eased. She could move without wincing. Naya still kept the rifle near, but it rested more often on the wall than in her hands. Wyatt didn't ask what they planned to do next. He didn't have to. The way they carried themselves told him they weren't leaving. They had no place to go back to, and the cabin once haunted had become their last safe ground. One frosted morning, Wyatt was mending the fence by the pen when the door creaked open. Lila stepped out barefoot, her mended dress brushing the porch boards, the shawl pulled close against the cold. A folded blanket lay at her feet, set down like a small offering. She stood there quietly, breathing the sharp air, not running from it anymore. Her eyes wandered past the fence to the 2 graves by the pines. She didn't step closer, but her gaze lingered long enough for him to understand. She knew. She understood the reason he never left, the reason he kept this cabin standing while everything else in his life had fallen. Wyatt set down his hammer, his breath fogging in the cold. He didn't speak. He just stood beside her on the porch, the snow whispering underfoot, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the only living soul in that hollow stretch of land. Lila Skyhawk didn't step aside when Wyatt McAllister came back through the door. She simply turned and followed, no longer hesitating, no longer measuring the distance between them before entering the same room. Inside, Naya Moonfeather was boiling water on the stove, while Tessa Redbird sorted strips of cloth into neat piles. None of them startled when the door closed behind him. That small shift told Wyatt everything he needed to know. The danger hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled the air they breathed. Lila gestured toward the pot, then to the shelves where the dry venison and salt were kept. She was asking if she could cook. Wyatt gave a single nod and stepped back. She tore the meat into strips, dropped them into the pot, and salted it by instinct. Naya split kindling with quiet precision. Tessa wiped down the table, setting out tin cups as if she'd done it 100 times before. By the time Wyatt returned from the creek with another bucket of water, the place looked less like a hideout and more like a home trying to remember itself. When he stepped inside, all 3 women were gathered near the bed, whispering softly. They fell silent, not out of fear, but to see if he would interrupt. He didn't. He set down the bucket, hung his coat on the peg, and let them be. A moment later, Lila crossed the room toward him. She touched her ribs where the wound had healed, then brushed her fingers against the collar of the mended dress. She said one word, soft, low, full of meaning. He didn't understand the language, but he didn't need to. Gratitude didn't require translation. Night came without wind. The stove's orange glow filled the cabin, turning cold timber into something that felt alive again. Wyatt sat on the cot, back against the wall, the same spot where he'd slept every night since Evelyn had died. Tessa lay near the fire, under a blanket, her injured leg stretched out and steady. Naya leaned by the window, not guarding it now, just watching the night fold across the plains. And Lila sat on the bed, her hair loose, the shawl hanging from her shoulders instead of clenched around her. She studied Wyatt for a long moment, not as a stranger, but as a man whose quiet had begun to make sense to her. Then she said his name softly. Wyatt. He looked up, meeting her eyes, and gave a single nod. It was the first time she'd spoken his name, without fear hiding behind it. Before turning, Naya unbarred the door an inch to let in a sliver of night air. Wyatt didn't stop her. Tessa smiled faintly when Lila handed her part of the quilt, a simple gesture of trust. No one reached for a weapon that night. When the fire dimmed to embers, the silence that filled the cabin wasn't the old, empty kind, the kind that had haunted Wyatt since the graves were dug behind the pines. It was the quiet of people who stayed because they chose to. Wyatt didn't stretch out on the floor. He stayed seated on the cot, hat tipped forward, rifle resting near his knee, eyes half closed. Lila lay down, but didn't turn her back to the room. She kept her gaze on the flicker of dying firelight, listening to the even rhythm of 3 other heartbeats in the dark. Outside, no horses moved. No boots broke the silence. The door stayed shut, and for the first time in years, no one inside the cabin feared it anymore.